Our podcast today features Professor Joel Rothman from UCSB. He's the director of the Center for Aging and Longevity Studies. So we talk about aging. We talk about research that's being done to slow the process and the questions and answers that it gives us. I thought this was absolutely fascinating, and the science is so spectacular and accelerating so quickly.
Yeah, I did too. And, you know, this grouping of episodes we're doing for anti-aging, the deconstructing anti-aging, this one was different than what we've been doing, in that we actually had someone here with a lab and actual science, and lots to say about things that are really close to coming to fruition for longevity and anti-aging.
Yeah, because a lot of it is based, on other people's studies, and when we've talked about this generally, and the general population does, everybody has an opinion of who said what and who's published this, that, and the other thing. But this is where the rubber hits the road. This is where the science is really being done, and it's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and he was so enthusiastic and excited himself about this topic, and he absolutely loves what he does. So it's a great episode.
Yeah, I think it's a really great episode.
Enjoy
it. But what do I know? I'm just a vagina doctor. Professor Joel Rothman, welcome to the Vagina Doctor podcast.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
Great. Thanks for sending us some information on you, and your bio is so impressive. But I want to read actually what's written here, because I think it's anything less would be inappropriate, in my opinion. Distinguished Professor of Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, Wilcox Family Chair in Biotechnology, and founding director of the Center for Aging and Longevity Studies at UC Santa Barbara. For 3 decades, his research group has explored embryonic development, programmed cell suicide, tissue reprogramming, and aging, supported by many research grants from the National Institute of Aging, the National Cancer Institute, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and other agencies. You've overseen an interdisciplinary training of doctoral students as the director of Biomolecular Science and Engineering program, and served as chair of the Department of MCD Biology. You're an elective fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. But prior to your graduate studies, you were the head winemaker at Buena Vista Winery in Sonoma and a classical music radio program announcer.
I can't tell you how much nicer that sounds when spoken through an English accent.
Oh, thank you.
Well, everything sounds better. Yes, everything sounds better. It's true.
Well, all right, good. Moving on. The Center for Aging and Logistical Studies, you're the director of this.
Yes.
It's relatively new. I mean, what you've been doing is not new, but is the organization itself fairly recent?
Yeah, I've been working on this for about 15 years, but really it came together in the last couple of years when I came to realize that we had a lot more activity in aging and longevity research across a broad span of disciplines at UCSB than I had previously known. And we were able to assemble now 34 faculty spanning about 15 departments and centers that bridge from, at its core, biomedical sciences across to engineering and the physical sciences on the one hand, and to psychology, anthropology, the social sciences, and even humanities and fine arts. So we've really integrated our research areas across a very broad domain of research that's possible at a broad university like UCSB. And we had a public launch in April, so it's really quite new from that standpoint.
And I also read in the information from the center, 300 researchers, a lot of people that are not on faculty, but they're doing research directed by you, assisted by you, or
Well, indirectly. So there are about 350 researchers. Those include graduate students, postdocs, staff researchers associated with those 34 research groups that are part of the center.
You know, it's anti-aging is obviously a very popular subject for people to learn about, read about. We're all interested in living longer, healthier lives, more productive lives. But there's so much that's not proven, not very accurate, or people's personal opinions. And so that's what's so great about being able to talk to you about it, because you're doing the real stuff. You are doing the here's the truth, you know, and it's and also put into perspective with everything else. So the medical profession, being part of that, we've been woefully inadequately trained in certain areas, but particularly diet and nutrition. Mm-hmm. And we've really can only say with any confidence that the only things that we can say are significant in prolonging a healthy life are diet and exercise. But you go into the real details, the cellular function, where you can see these things happening. You don't have to look at somebody over 50 years to know this. You can do it. You can get that information much easier through the experiments that you do. So I'm almost embarrassed at the lack of knowledge in my profession about this, and I'm part of that. We do a lot of work with hormones and so on, and we'll talk about hormones later. But I want to just have you tell us about what you're doing, what's exciting right now, what things have surprised you.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So
Thanks.
First of all, I pick up on one thing you said, that in medical school there's very little taught on diet and nutrition, and I found that amusing because my wife's grandmother used to always say that, because she was very much into nutrition and took lots of vitamins and things. And she insisted that medical schools should bring more in on that subject, and they haven't, of course.
Right.
But her approach to longevity worked out so. She died at 103 and had all of her wits. So yeah. She was living proof.
Yes,
N equals one, though. So the reason that I started this center, actually, and the reason my research has really grown even more rapidly in this area, is because of some really spectacular and dramatic breakthroughs in our understanding of the control of the aging clock, how rapidly we age, and how we can manipulate it to slow it down and ultimately extend lifespan quite substantially. Now, I want to say at the outset, our goal in the center, and certainly my own lab, is not to extend longevity per se. We're not trying to make people live to 200 years old. I'm not ruling out that as a possibility. I can say more about that. I can speculate in it, whether that's going to be possible later. I personally think it actually is, but that's not our driving goal. Our driving goal is to stretch the period of health span, the period of healthy, youthful, vigorous phase of your life, to stretch that, in so doing, basically not conquer, but forestall a wide range of diseases simultaneously. So the way medicine is practiced now, the way medical research is practiced now, is we focus on one type of disease. It might be cardiovascular, or cancer, or neurodegeneration, or osteoporosis, or obesity, or diabetes, and so forth. And what we know from studies in the laboratory, by manipulating genes in laboratory animals, and not only by manipulating the genes, but by giving them the appropriate compounds, drugs, we can slow the rate at which they age and slow the onset of all those diseases. So the goal really is to delay the onset of the period of life that we all don't particularly want to extend. Mm-hmm. And in so doing, make a healthier, happier, more vibrant and productive population. Our hope would be that will not necessarily extend longevity a long time. I mean, it would certainly average longevity would go up because these diseases wouldn't be as common. But our goal is not to really extend lifespan enormously. It may happen, but that's not our primary goal. But instead to make people be much more productive and healthy for a longer period. If what we would love to see is what's called morbidity compression. And what that means is the period of life that is, when you really are suffering with the decline of late years, that period is quite short. I mean, that's what we'd like to see. So basically make a better life for everyone. That's really our driving goal. Yeah. Now, you asked me sort of what are the things that I found the most exciting or the most striking, let's say. I don't know if I summed up your question properly. But,
yes, you did.
And really, it started first about 30 years ago when some discoveries were made that I found very startling. And that is that a single change in one gene in the laboratory model animal that I've worked on for many years can extend its lifespan. And in fact, you can extend the lifespan of these animals about 10-fold longer than their normal lifespan. So that would be comparable to human living 700 or 800 years.
Yeah.
And when that is done, what you observe is the period of youth for these animals is likewise extended. So if you look at two identical creatures, the only difference is a single gene change in the long-lived ones, and you put them side by side at the time when the normal ones are right at the edge of dying, and anybody in the world would recognize this. If they look in the microscope, they'd say that one's an old one. Even if you'd never looked at these creatures before. They get fat, they get wrinkled, they're slow, they stop having sex. It's just like humans. And next to them, you put the single gene mutant, single gene change version of these guys. And right when the normal ones are at the end of death, these guys are looking fantastic. They look like they're years younger, except all of this occurs over a matter of weeks. Yeah. So that really started getting me to thinking about the fact that we can study the problem of aging and the problems of longevity control in the same way we could study any other biological phenomenon, any other cellular phenomenon. For years, I've studied developmental biology, how an egg turns into a complex creature like us. We can use the same tools, the same level of understanding, and same rigor. We can apply the same rigor to those questions to the problems of aging and longevity. Now, that's not a specific. I can go back and give you some specifics that have really struck me lately.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so
please.
So the field has really accelerated from them there enormously, which is why we now have not only many centers all over the world focused on this problem, but biotech companies, over 100 biotech companies that are out there to treat or cure aging. There's a controversy about whether aging is a disease. Some people regard it as such. The World Health Organization categorized it as a disease some years ago. I think they've backtracked on that. But if you think of it as a disease, then it's something else that the medical community should treat just like anything else that causes suffering and a loss of health. In the last 10 years, some really striking breakthroughs have occurred. And I'll tell you the last one at the end that really blows my mind. One is that we now have quite rigorous ways to date our biological age. Not our chronological age, but our biological age.
Yes, I understand.
I just got back from my 50th high school reunion just last weekend, and I was pretty startled to see my classmates, all of us the same age, some of whom looked 50 and some of them who looked 90. There was actually a gentleman who looked 90, all our age, couldn't believe it. And I suspect if you use these methods for testing biological age, you would find that it fell into place pretty well with what one observes, plastic surgery notwithstanding. So that's cheating. And I can, without getting too technical, basically it is called the epigenetic clock. This was first evolved by Steve Horvath, who's now at Altos, one of the biotech companies that's doing, he was at UCLA when he did this, but Altos is one of the big biotech companies working on aging. And he found that by looking at changes in what's called the epigenome, you could actually look at the progress of aging, and you could quite pretty accurately, plus or minus 4 years, I think it is, really determine one's biological age and make predictions about how long they're likely to live. It's a little scary. I don't want to do this because I'm afraid I'll find my clock is farther along than I want it to be.
What is an epigenome?
So the epigenome so the genome, of course, is the sum of all of our DNA that makes us. So it's the sequence of all of the what are called base pairs, all the instructions that make us. The epigenome is sort of layered on top of that. So that is what happens to the DNA after it's packaged into the nucleus of our cells, the control center of our cells. And there are chemical modifications that occur to various parts of the DNA. Those don't show up in the sequence. So you've heard about the fact that the human genome has been sequenced. That is, the whole code has been taken apart. Instead, those modifications to different parts of the DNA change whether it is actually turned on or off in that region. That is, whether it produces a product, whether it codes effectively for a product or it doesn't. Basically, our genome is just a sum of instructions for making lots of different products. Most of those products are proteins. We have tens of thousands of different proteins. They make us who we are.
So when they're looking at that, is it just a blood draw? Or when you say it...
I believe it can even be done with a cheek swab, but yes, a blood draw would do it. All you need is a bit of you, and just, of course, more and more now, it's possible to get whole genome sequences of people. That's getting very inexpensive. But this is a layer above that. This is the epigenome.
Okay.
That doesn't change the sequences of the genome, but it changes how the genome is read out. And that changes as we age. And you can, from a blood draw, you can actually determine roughly where you are, effectively where you are with age. Now, that has a downside. Like I said, I didn't really want to do it unless you can intervene in it. If I found out I'm farther along than I wanted to be, that's just depressing, right? But you can also use it as a feedback system,
right,
to test yourself. And because this science is still very much in its infancy, you can, in principle, you could do experiments on yourself. You could say, okay, if I eat certain things, or if I exercise a certain way, or if I lose weight, all of those certainly for sure have an impact on the epigenome. There's no question. They do change the aging clock. If there's behaviors, or in fact, if there are things I can take, pharmaceuticals, nutritional supplements, whatever, and actually see if they have a change. You can actually read that out. So that's being used by the scientific community to look for new drugs that slow the rate of aging. And the advantage is there's a relatively quick readout, meaning on the order of maybe years, but it doesn't take a whole lifespan to figure out, whether a drug has been effective for slowing the rate of aging. So it's very effective in that regard.
And what drug are they? I mean, are you saying they're making a drug, or is there a drug? Or
there are lots of drugs, several anyway, I should say, that clearly have an impact on the rate of aging in experimental models in the lab, experimental animals.
So they're experimental drugs.
Some of these are drugs that Dr. Turner could prescribe right now.
Okay.
That would be repurposing existing drugs. The most famous of those is called rapamycin.
Oh, yeah.
Rapamycin has been used for decades, I believe, as an immune suppressant to prevent tissue rejection, an organ transplantation, for example.
Okay.
But it was found in model animals that it has another effect, which is it does seem to slow the rate of aging. There are people who are experimenting with themselves right now taking rapamycin. I know people have told me that. I'm not ready to do it, because we don't really know the consequences of long-term administration of rapamycin.
Well, how do they know? How do you know it's slowing down your aging?
You can actually give it to laboratory animals. And I should say, not only the little tiny animals we work on, the microscopic animals called C. elegans, the little experimental animal that has been used for many decades, and 6 Nobel Prizes have been given for fundamental discoveries working with these things. But we can see it in these little animals, but also in rats and mice, which are, not so, in my view, not so distant from humans. If something works on these little worms we work on, and on fruit flies, which we've seen, and on rats and mice, it's very likely it's going to work on humans. We don't know the magnitude.
So
of
you
the
just
effect,
see one aging quicker than the other one.
you
that
can
you
see
gave
that
the
they age more slowly.
rapamycin
They
to.
live longer.
Mm-hmm.
They have delayed rates of cancer, slower rates of cancer, of neurodegeneration, of all age-related characteristics that you look at when you give them these compounds. They're slowed down. They are delayed in getting age-related decline symptoms. So, and of course, you can look at them in the shorter term using this aging clock, using the epigenetic aging clock I was referring to. That can be used not only in humans, but in fact, it's been done across the board with lots of animals. And it seems there are commonalities that occur across animals, by the way. Lots of different species of animals show similar sorts of changes, regardless of their lifespans, whether they are live to be 2 years old or they live to be hundreds of years old. And there are animals that live hundreds of years old.
What is the animal that you described? I've never heard of it.
C. elegans?
Yeah. What is that?
Yes. So it's one of the most celebrated, meaning with Nobel Prizes and other awards, laboratory animals used. And it's I'm biased because we use it in my lab, but
Nick,
I
pull
think
up a picture of a.
It's
What is it?
it's a little worm. It's only 1 millimeter long.
Oh, it's a worm.
Yeah.
my
Well,
God.
worm doesn't mean much, I will say. The word worm means animal with elongated body and no legs.
Spell it. What's the name?
C. elegans?
Yeah.
C. period. Elegans. ELEGANS. Elegans instead of elegant. And it is probably the most powerful system for studying aging.
It's like a little
Because
snake.
it
longevity.
responds very rapidly.
Because it responds rapidly, you can do a huge amount of things with it. You can get huge numbers of them, and their lifespan is short. You don't have to wait 30 years to find out
Here,
the
Nick
results
has
of
an
your
image.
experiments.
Is this what they look like?
That's it. Those are them. They look more fun when you actually watch them move. It's the most completely described animal on the planet. It is the only animal for which every single cell has been identified, for which it's not the only animal, but it's almost the only. It was the first animal. In fact, that was done by my postdoc mentor, for which the nervous system connections, all the connections in the brain and the whole nervous system have been worked out. So we have a wiring diagram of a brain, of the whole nervous system of an animal that came out of working on this. And it is this extremely desirable tool for looking at drugs and genetic changes and other things, other interventions we might come up with that affect the rate of aging and longevity. I mean, the readout is a few weeks. If you extend its lifespan, you just wait a few more weeks. If you double its lifespan, you'll see it in 6 weeks instead of 3.
Oh, wow.
So now, the concern always is, okay, great, but it's a little worm. Who cares? It's something you grow in a bunch of academic labs. You know, what the heck is that? But the discoveries that have made with this animal and other laboratory animals, fruit flies I mentioned, have been used in these studies too. Most of them have translated over to mice. And again, if you see it span that much of animal evolution, because we're mammals like mice, you can feel not completely, but fairly confident it's these, whatever the interventions are likely to have some effect on humans. And that has, well, I shouldn't say that's rigorously proven to be the case yet. There are clinical trials right now going on with rapamycin on older individuals to query their effects on humans to see if it slows the rate of age-related diseases and the rate of aging. So these discoveries in these little laboratory animals translate in a fairly rapid period of time into interventions in humans. The slow step for humans is if we find a drug that works very effectively in all of those creatures I mentioned, worms, fruit flies, and mice, if we're not repurposing them, but they're brand new, then really the slow step is not so much the scientific discovery, which is time consuming, but that's not the slow step. The slow step is really getting a drug to market.
Yeah.
Going
But
through all the clinical
rapamycin
trials.
is at market.
Yes,
for
that's a
something else.
repurposed drug. That's what I'm saying.
But
So
is it for something else or for
Yes.
anti-aging?
It is not for anti-aging. It's certainly not approved for that.
It's
but
approved for what is
for
it exactly?
tissue rejection
So
is one. That's one. I'm not an MD, so it may be
for
used
an
other things,
which autoimmune disease is tissue
but
rejection?
I don't know if it's used for autoimmune diseases, but for transplantations,
Yeah.
Oh, transplantations. Okay.
maybe. I don't
That
know
was
that it's
how
used-
I believe it was what it was first used
Right.
for, was covering stents that put in cardiac coronary vessels,
Right.
and also for immunosuppressant for kidney transplant
Right.
patients.
It-
And with that activity raises a whole bunch of questions as to how safe is this going to be, because it's immunosuppressive. So yes, you're going to take a bunch of stuff and live longer and get more disease.
Again, I'm not a physician. I don't know if there are patients who have been treated with rapamycin for years, but I doubt it. I think it's used more acutely. So what happens if you take this immune suppressant for 30 years?
Yeah.
One of our first lines of defense against cancer, for example, is the immune system. So, is that going to be a side effect? So we don't know that. That's why I'm not ready to just start popping this stuff.
No, right. But people are.
People are. They're taking their chances.
Yeah.
We may look back and jealously at them and say, hey, they did the right thing, right?
Or maybe not.
Or maybe not, right?
How does a drug like rapamycin that was used for this other reason get repurposed? Whose idea is that? How does that come about?
Well, it emerges from the scientific literature, first of all. There needs to be strong, rigorous data supporting its use. And there is the basic science behind rapamycin and the slowing of the longevity clock, the aging clock, and the extension of longevity is borne out by many studies that have been done in laboratory settings. But then, if it's an approved drug, except maybe certain controls, and I'm sure Duncan can say much more about this, I think physicians have the leeway to
off-label application.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, you have the ability to do that. I think there are probably some drugs you can't. I assume maybe not all drugs.
Yes, correct.
But rapamycin is it's not a controlled substance or anything. So
yes.
So I think it's up to the community of physicians to make those decisions, and each physician can make that decision individually.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, wait, did I get you off track though? What were we saying before I asked the question?
No,
we were talking about the breakthroughs. Let's
Okay,
Okay,
let's go on.
And this is the most, to my mind, this is the best known.
Mm-hmm.
Right. People talk about it a lot.
Yeah. And it's yet you can see how it's fraught with danger every step that you take.
Yep.
And then there are lots of other issues regarding trying to increase the longevity and so on. But just keep going with this.
Are there human studies?
They're ongoing right now. There are trials.
So how long have these people in the trials been on it?
Few years, couple of years.
And how are they doing?
I don't think anything's been published on it yet.
Okay.
So there was one progress report I saw, but I don't think there's anything solid yet.
Okay.
That certainly I'm aware of. So I mean, this is right at the beginnings of this stuff.
Right.
Now, what I'll say is, if it's not rapamycin, there will be tons of other things. There's a big push to find lots of different compounds that do this. So there will be something I think there will be things coming that have the similar effects. And with any new drug, you always run the risk of what's the long-term consequences. It's great, slows the aging clock, but what happens in 20 years?
Yeah.
So that's why our generation is in an awkward position. I will be willing to take a drug that's not extremely well studied, let's say, but has a clear impact as I reach my omega years.
Right.
Before that, I'd be much more disinclined to do it. That's my own personal thing.
Yeah.
I will also say, and I hope I don't offend any of your listeners, but there are lots of people taking all sorts of untested things. In fact,
that was my point, and right up front in our discussion of just this is the real thing. So many people just trying stuff,
right? And
if it doesn't work within a few months or so, or even maybe a few days, if it doesn't do what they want it to do, it's thrown out.
Right.
And so and that data is it's not of any value.
Right.
So this is where the expression where the rubber hits the road.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, but keep going.
And I'll say where I risk offending some of your listeners might be is the whole nutritional supplements industry, $1 billion industry. Virtually none of that is supported by rigorous science because, and those are not. Most of those are all nutritional supplements are not regulated by the FDA,
right?
To the best of my understanding, they have not been put to rigorous tests. People can try them on themselves, but they should be aware of that when they're buying these things and using them. And some of them, frankly, in my opinion, are actually probably risky to use. But
Do you take any supplements?
I do not. I was taking a multivitamin pill for many years, and then some studies. First of all, I know that because we have this process known as homeostasis, where we regulate, we have, after 4 billion years of evolution, we really regulate what we need very, very closely. If you have a well-balanced diet, if you take a multivitamin pill, you know where it all ends up. It ends up in the toilet in the next day or so. But there were there were hints in the literature that multivitamin supplements actually may not be beneficial.
Yeah. Well, I had a bad reaction to taking a lot of supplements once, so I don't take them.
Yeah. So I stopped taking, and I stopped taking blood thinners. I stopped taking aspirin once a day because there's, I am driven by what I see in the literature. When you make your own decision about yourself, it's about what you're going to do. It sure helps if you have scientific backing for that. That is large-scale studies that have been controlled carefully, and that you can look at a population effect rather than just sort of hope it's going to work.
Right.
And anecdotal evidence is not really evidence, right? My friend took this thing and they look great or whatever.
It drives me crazy.
Well, that's, there's tons of that out there.
I was watching Good Morning America this morning, and their physician that they have on there a lot was talking about how not eating as much is like the best thing you could do to slow down the aging process. Fewer calories.
Is almost certainly going to work in humans. I hate to say it.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about avoiding obesity now. This is dietary restriction. You're talking about. This is caloric restriction, where you're right at the threshold of starvation. If you live right at the if you live a daily life where you're at the threshold of starvation, any one individual you can't say, but over the population, based on every study that's been done in every animal that's been looked at, including primates, that is to say chimpanzees, you will see a slower rate of aging and an increase in longevity. Now, I'm not saying it works in humans, but I'd be really shocked
there's
if
definitely some anecdotal evidence
say that.
In certain areas of the world where people just do eat less.
Right.
And their diet is different.
And certain kinds of diet, the blue zones, the diet from the blue zones, where they're the oldest living groups of humans. And that is traceable to diet to a large degree.
There was, I'm sorry to interrupt what you're saying for a moment, but there was a documentary about blue zones 10 years ago, I think. And the one blue zone was down in Los Angeles. And it was a religious... I don't want to say sect because that just there were people of very devout practitioners of a particular religion.
I know what is it? Is it? It wasn't Mormons. It was
right. It was a Christian religion, but it was
Google the blue zone in California.
But there was a doc as an example on this who was 95 and driving to work.
But they were a religious group.
Yes, yeah. So their diet was controlled by their habits, and what seemed to come through to me the lessons out of this blue zone was that you needed to be contributing to society, you needed to be active.
Yes,
and your diet needed to be controlled, and you needed to be social.
Yep.
And maybe there were a few other things, but it was...
those are all spot on. Those are all things that all of us, we hope, can build into our own lives without giving up too much.
Seventh-day Adventists.
Oh, it's Seventh-day Adventists, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But on Good Morning America this morning, they were saying just to cut, like if you take your portion size at every meal and just cut it in half.
Yeah.
That would be... there.
America could benefit from this.
Because
obesity, of course, is a huge health problem.
Yeah.
And it contributes to all sorts of other ailments. But what we're talking about is something slightly different. When dietary restriction, when you're at the edge of starvation, what happens is you're lowering your rate of metabolism. And metabolism, which is occurring in a focused way on your mitochondria, that is a part of the cell that we all have that creates the energy for us. That takes energy from our food and turns it into a useful energy that cells can use. When that process occurs, there are damaging side products that come out of this. They're called reactive oxygen species that tear apart cells. And the more of this, the more metabolism you have, the more reactive oxygen species you produce, and that contributes to aging. Now, I grossly oversimplified the reality of that, but that is one of the mechanisms that's thought to underlie dietary restriction or caloric restriction. And my lab studies mitochondria and mitochondrial health. That's an important part of what we do, and its relationship to aging. So we think about this problem quite a bit. You can look at me. I am not calorically restricted. And some people claim, actually, it's not really true that people live longer. It just feels like life is longer if you're not eating. Like, can I get
it's not
over
as fun.
It's not as fun. I'm not willing to go that way.
Well, I mean, I think I've said before to maybe a couple family members or my daughter, you don't need as much food as you think you need. Like,
right.
It's you're bored or you're thirsty or
constantly.
And I've been accused of, you have an eating disorder or whatever. Right. And I'm like, well, no, why is it that somebody that is just conscious and aware of what they're eating, why are they accused of having an eating disorder? Whereas other people that eat too much,
I think that's an eating disorder that most of us have. I am certainly not the only one who got the COVID-19, right? I didn't get the disease, but I got the COVID-19 around my waist, or maybe the COVID-20, whatever, 30, whatever, because I was at home so much and there was food right in there in the kitchen every time I walked around there.
And everyone cooked more and everyone, It was comfort food.
Right. Yeah.
Comfort COVID.
I mean, it'd be nice if we could just eat as much as we want. We don't, we could block the metabolism. And so that actually is one angle that is being worked on in biotechnology to try to prevent us from extracting the energy of our food. So we, more of the quality food that we're taking in is actually just expelled.
Right. Because it was probably never meant that we would have so much food available to us. Packaged food.
Meant is looking at evolution with the lens of rationality, but you can justify what evolution produces, because what evolution produces is the ability to create the next generation that's thriving, right? I mean, that's really what evolution does. It's just the generations that thrive better are going to populate the world. I mean, that's what natural selection is all about. And we have been strongly selected, and I think it's acutely true in places where food has been very limited, to get as much caloric goodies out of our food as possible. And our ancestors 20,000 years ago, went through feast and famine, maybe not even feast that much, but certainly long periods of famine where they're just barely getting enough food. So when we get that food, the first thing we do is stick it away as fast as possible in our fat stores. And there are populations that have lived, I think some Pacific Island populations, where they've lived in an environment where food, caloric input was really limited. And those populations now in modern society, where food is so abundant, are even more subject to obesity. Right. But we all are now. I mean, America has gotten to be a pretty plump place. There's food
in fact,
everywhere.
most of the civilized world is that.
Absolutely.
It's changing the subject slightly. What about some other substances that have been touted as increasing longevity, such as metformin and NAD?
Right. So both of those have shown, and particularly NAD, good effects in model animals. But they're a little dicier, let's say, than rapamycin in terms of the studies. Metformin, particularly, was really looked very promising, but it's more controversial, and there are counterindications, not counterindications of the drug per se, but indications that it does not, in some animal environments, does not have the effect that we might hope for. There has been a clinical trial going on with metformin. I'm not sure what the status is right now, but the studies have not seemed so promising with metformin. And NAD I've considered taking that myself, in fact. The nice thing about NAD is it's just something that we ourselves make. It's a natural component of our bodies.
Right.
And how it works to slow down aging in model studies, model animals, it's not clear. There's lots of theories behind it, and there are some biochemical experiments that are consistent with it. Part of it may be through resetting the epigenome. That's probably one of the major sort of ideas behind this. But I would be much less worried about taking NAD than the other things because we make it all the time.
Yeah.
So
how would you take it? Because, there's a supplement form now. There's a little injection, or there's an IV drip.
I would say the answer is at this point, I wouldn't want to answer that question because the studies aren't in.
Okay.
I mean, which is most effective? Are any effective in humans? We don't know the answers. That's so I wouldn't make a claim.
Okay.
But the easiest is just to take the oral supplement.
Yeah.
And you know, until we know more, that's probably what I would do. I don't want to get an IV unless I really know it's going to work.
Yeah.
I don't like needles.
Yeah, I know. I don't either.
So we may be getting to that, but if not, I'll slip it in here. So I was talking about all the great breakthroughs. The really startling things recently is not only that it appears that we can fiddle with the aging clock. We have a way now to monitor it. That's this epigenetic aging clock that I mentioned.
Right.
But there are ways it looks like that we may be able to reset it, both by making gene changes, but also by sort of reintroducing a youthful state of cells. So this comes from studies that were about something else originally, that is how we can turn any of our cells into ultimately embryonic cells. So there was a Nobel Prize given to Yamanaka for this, and there are a set of factors called the Yamanaka factors. These are proteins. They're called transcription factors. That means they're proteins that regulate how the genome is transcribed, how it's turned on or off. Originally, there was a set of 4 of these. When turned on inappropriately, that is, they normally wouldn't be on, but when turned on inappropriately in some of our cells, like our skin cells, and those cells are allowed to grow in culture, you can actually convert those into essentially stem cells. So these are cells that normally would not be normally stem cells. Stem cells are cells that can keep giving rise to more cells and ultimately populate more specialized cell types. So you can actually induce them into pluripotent stem cells. This is called induced pluripotent stem cells, iPSC, which are cells that ultimately are capable of regenerating a whole animal. Could be a human. It hasn't been done with humans, as far as I know, unless it's been done in a clandestine way. But it certainly can be done in mice, in sheep, etc. It's being done in the animal industry, the livestock industry. So these factors, what they do is they reset the genome. They reset the state of it. They reset the epigenome and allow it to revert back to the way it was when we were embryos, when we were developing in our mother's wombs. Okay, so that's a major breakthrough.
Okay, but I need an example.
Well, that's not the aging thing yet, but go ahead.
Well, when you say you're resetting and you're taking it back, what are you doing to see that? What is the...
Okay, so, and I haven't gotten to the aging part yet, but what you see is you can take these cells that are normally, like in your skin or whatever in an adult, and from them you can create ultimately a new embryo. You can create the next generation from those cells. It's essentially cloning. That is cloning of your cells.
And then where do you put them back in?
Yeah, we would implant them. For example, it's a mouse. You'd implant it back into a
so you pull out.
Mouse. Yep.
And
pull
then
out
you
some
do
cells,
this.
do this stuff in the lab.
Okay.
Let the cells grow until they're these stem cells. And then you can put them back and make an embryo.
Okay, keep going.
So basically you're creating the next generation that's virtually identical to you genetically. If you did this and waited as many years as you've been around, she would look like your twin sister, except you'd be older. So that was the first indication that you can reset the state of cells and bring them back to this very early stage. Now, this one thing I'll say is that if you think about, well, is it at all possible for humans ever to become immortal, for example? I say, oh, it's already been done. So why are we talking about it? We carry immortality within us, in fact, because we produce a set of cells that go on and produce the next generation. And my children I now have a grandchild, produced a cells that came from my set of cells and ran down the line. It's a continuous living, it's not a full organism, but a continuous living entity that divides and divides and divides. Cells keep dividing, and that is immortal. We, as long as this planet were sustainable, this could go on forever. So each of us has, if we're fertile, has immortality within us. So that's sort of already achievable. And this Yamanaka factor thing that I was talking about, so what we know is that our aging state is reset every generation. You know, a baby that's born from an older person doesn't look old; they look like a baby.
Yeah,
they start fresh. So you can refresh the state of cells to make new embryos. It turns out, and that's one of the really exciting things in the last 2 to 3 years, 3 years, I think it was. If you express those factors in model animals, you can actually slow the rate of aging very substantially. You slow down the rate of aging. You're sort of refreshing them, bringing them to a more youthful state. And in some cases, you can actually observe what appears to be reversal of aging. You can actually reverse aspects of aging. And one of the most exciting things that has emerged from this in the last month is the discovery of chemical compounds that, as a cocktail, that is a mixture of them, can do the same thing. So you don't even have to manipulate genes. This is not in animals yet. This is in cells, in cultured cells. But using the epigenetic clock I spoke of as a measure of how old the cells are, you can actually make them have an epigenome that looks younger just with exposure to a collection of chemical compounds. That's that's heading toward a Ponce de Leon drug. Now, it's going to be years before that really, in practice, is effective on us. And this may just be a demonstration of the principle rather than, will these compounds actually be used in the long term? I don't know if it's going to be these compounds. There'll be all sorts of side effects, et cetera. It's going to be really hard for the pharmaceutical industry, for example, to refine these to a point where they're not going to cause nasty side effects. Will these particular compounds turn into Ponce de Leon drugs? We have no idea. They could, they may not, but they certainly demonstrate that it is conceivable to do that we may well be able to reverse aspects of aging. And it's a little frightening and exciting. The impact on the world is a very serious concern. But I think based on what we've seen, and this is not science fiction now, this is rigorous science with lots of data and carefully reviewed science. It looks like we are getting to the point where there are things we could do to perhaps not only slow the aging clock, but back it up at least a bit. And so when you talked about what do you think are the most exciting things in the field, I would say that's mind-blowing. I mean, I don't think that we would have imagined this years ago. But to me, in retrospect, it's not surprising because we do it every generation. Yeah. Right? That's my kids were babies. They started fresh again, and they came from my cells and my wife's cells. So, it's doable.
For people working with you and seeing this before their eyes, like, oh, wow, this is promising. Is there some type of, who can get a job doing this where you're going to feel okay? Like, are they going to steal this or take it or sell it? Or is there any fear or worry of that? Or?
Well, we have intellectual property laws in this country and around the world, right?
Yes, but still.
So you don't go public with the details until you've got your patent in place. And if somebody violates that patent, then out come the lawyers, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, we are protected in that regard, unless but it's very difficult for a scientist like me who loves to talk about my science.
Yeah.
To hold back. I have a few patents on some other things, but I just feel very uncomfortable holding back information. And if I didn't discover these compounds, if I discovered them, I would have to bite my tongue if I wanted to preserve the intellectual property. So, and to me, that goes against the environment of the academic scientific, the academic scientific environment goes against what as
Yes.
I've been
You
raised
want
in.
to share the knowledge.
Sharing the knowledge. So it just delays when you share the knowledge. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the hope. But that it's the same as patenting anything else, right? Any other discovery. It's
What's a
exactly the same
typical day like for you? Are you in the laboratory? Are you managing?
I manage the laboratory. So a typical day, my job as a professor is I had no idea what being a professor was before I, went into grad school and got my PhD. It is the best job on earth, in my opinion, being a biomedical scientist. I can't think of a better job. It's also it's not an easy job. Long hours, decades of working 80-hour weeks. That's how it was. Same is true in the medical profession. So it was intense, and it's still intense. It hasn't gotten any easier because the competition is fierce. Competition for research grants, for top staff member, top graduate students and postdocs in one's lab. Competition for publications. It's highly competitive. But my typical day is all over the map because there's so much variety in my job. I have tremendous freedom in the academic environment. And if I do well, I'm rewarded for that. But it could be working on writing a paper with one of my graduate students. It's obviously regularly I'm advising my grad students and postdocs, the people who actually do the experiments in the lab. I am not in the lab myself. Most people at my career stage, are not physically doing the experiments in the lab. I will oversee them. And a lot of my time, frankly, is spent chasing money from funding agencies, mostly the National Institutes of Health. That consumes a lot of time. We can't do the work without being able to pay the people who are doing the work. And that's a very competitive environment. About typically in the institutes that I've been funded by, the NIH has a few dozen individual institutes. And the National Institute on Aging is one of the ones that funds me, and National Institute on Child Health and Human Development is another one. And the funding levels are typically around our single-digit percentages. So you have, many investigators writing these research grants, and any one grant that goes in has about a 7% chance, let's say, or 8%, something like that, of getting funded. And it can take a few months to write these things. So it's a pretty time-consuming part of it. But I get to do so many things. I travel around the world talking about my science. Of course, I teach. Teaching is an important part because I'm in an academic environment.
Yeah.
But also bring undergraduates. It's not only graduate students and postdocs, but undergraduates to do research in my lab. And then, if I choose, I can create a new center that's targeted at extending our healthy lifespan, the Center for Aging and Longevity Studies. So that obviously is an important part of my life right now.
Yeah.
You looking at the website that at UCSB relative to the Center for Aging and Longevity Studies, it seemed you are engaging the community in as involvement, and either as well, I would suppose that they would be part of studies and rather than anything else. So that's, do you have trouble finding people to do that?
Not really. So the more we publicize what we're doing, the more we get interest.
Yeah.
I will say that all of our studies through the center so far are on the psychosocial vein. We're not a medical school. We're not set up to do clinical trials or anything like that. If people want to try some drugs, don't come to us. We're not in a position to do that. But for studying the psychosocial aspects of aging, the perception of life as it changes over the lifespan, those kinds of things, then there are those studies are available, and people do sign up for those. And we, as the center has grown and become more known, we're getting more interest in those sorts of things for sure. But the community outreach is a major component of what we're building. We've had several community events. We have lectures going all year round that are open to the public. We invite the public. Anybody who wants to hear about these just has to send an email to the center or to me personally. We'll get them on the email list. We had a beautiful grand opening event at the Music Academy, which was a really nice event for the public. We have coming up in April of next year, and this is going to be wide open for the public. I hope we get a really good turnout. We're going to have a longevity fair, as we call it. So this is, and we're still sort of figuring out exactly what it'll be, but there will be people with booths presenting various aspects of what they can do to help support the community. These can be retirement communities. These can be physicians. These can be even just services that are useful for older people, and academic. We'll present as part of the center, and we'll also have a keynote speaker involved, and that's tied to the Cottage Hospital Research Symposium that happens annually as well, which will be the day before.
Where is that going to be?
We don't have a venue yet. We're still figuring that out. If anybody's listening and has a good idea for a venue, let me know.
Oh, I'll be thinking.
We want to do probably, outdoors so that we can, have space for a bunch of people, at least for the fair part of the thing. But this is just in the works right now. That's another one of our events so I have felt uncomfortable creating and running a Center for Aging and Longevity Studies, given the impact of this science, potential impact on society. I felt very uncomfortable doing that without a discussion of the ethical and ecological effects.
My next question.
Okay.
This science will.
Said it. It's heading right into. So I can talk about that, and I could let you ask your question if you like. But
it was just the subject, the ethical steps, concerns, obstacles that are going to be there.
Right. So I come home every night, and my wife asked me, are you sure you want to do this, Joel? Because we're very concerned about the state of the planet, of course. Mm-hmm. And we're very concerned about income disparity in this country and around the world. I mean, the income disparity is just ridiculous. And, a upper middle class American is so fabulously wealthy compared to the average human on the planet, for example. Those are a couple of the biggest issues. So, I don't feel comfortable running the center without including a strong ethical component. So we've already had a debate that was open to the public. We had it on campus. I'd like to do it again in town, so it's more accessible. Campus isn't a possible place to park. So, and in that case, I had a scientist and an ethicist on each side of the argument. The question was, should we extend healthy longevity? You can imagine which side I took. And there was an ethicist on my side, the pro side, and then on the other side, there was an ethicist and scientist on the other side talking about the downsides. And I am very concerned that we continue to press forward with these discussions, because whether we do it in the Center for Aging and Longevity here or not, it's happening all over the world. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very important for the public to be aware of what's coming and to contribute to the conversations and think about how we're going to change policy. It's going to change everything about our societies. If people are living first of all, positively, of course, enormously, healthcare costs may become diminished substantially. If we achieve this morbidity compression, we'll be expending much less in treating people with dire, grave diseases, if we can achieve that. That's a big deal. But we may achieve lifespan of 150 years, for example, a life expectancy of 150 years. A life expectancy has doubled in the last 100 years. It has doubled. Most of that has been because of infant mortality. Nonetheless, not all of it. We may be living to 150 years. That has significant consequences on the planet, of course, right? I mean, we're going to have more people around, and the population on average will be older. Those are concerns. And the income disparity is a one that really does eat at me, because and here's how I've talked myself into feeling comfortable with it. The people who are going to have access to this technology first, of course, are they going to be the people with the most money. And some of the technology that's coming, for example, regenerative medicine, the ability to grow new organs. I mean, that science, and my lab works on those problems also. That science is moving very rapidly. You could take, and it comes back to what I was talking about with the Yamanaka factors. You could take cells from your body, like skin, and turn them into a heart. Ultimately, we're not there yet, but I think we're going to get there. We can turn them into heart cells. So why not turn them into a whole heart? So we could transplant a bad heart with a good heart that came from us. We're not going to reject it because it's not it's our own tissues. But that's going to be extremely expensive, and that will be available only to wealthy people initially. Now, my argument is this is going to be a problem for a while. There will be a tremendous income disparity when it comes to this kind of technology that's going to stretch our lifespan and certainly our health span. That makes me very uncomfortable. I don't think it'll be a permanent thing, just as true for virtually all other technologies. I'm challenged to think of any technology that was new 50 years ago that's not widely accessible to almost everybody, except maybe the extremely impoverished. I mean, cell phones, that technology 50 years ago, to have something, you couldn't have something that powerful in anything besides perhaps, a computer the size of this room. That's available everywhere. So the market tends to sort of adjust for that. So if there's a drug, for example, that costs billions to develop and it costs a huge amount to take initially, of course, the market will drive it because everybody in the world's going to want it because they're all going to want to, most people are going to want to stay young longer. That will drive down the costs. So the income disparity thing will, I think, self-correct itself. It's not perfect, but it will self-correct. The impact on the world population is real. That's something we have to really look at. I will say that the demographic projections, and I'm not a demographer, are that the population of the Earth is going up substantially through the end of this century, and then it's going to come down. Around 2100, it's projected to drop and then drop precipitously. And that's based on demographic projections, birth rates, and how the population is undergoing dynamic changes now. So it may not be as horrific a problem on the population as you might think. Having said that, because I'm wearing the hat of somebody who's so excited about the science, and I would love to, see people more youthful and be able to stay youthful longer. Should we not do this? The reason that life expectancy has doubled in the last 100 years is, can you think of what some of the biggest ones are? The biggest things there's one that's really simple.
I would say medications and antibiotics.
That's not as big, but that's big. That's certainly a big one. The biggest, I believe the biggest one, or just about the biggest one, is sanitation, sewers.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Infant mortality was, so widespread because of tainted water. Not only infants, everybody, but certainly infants would be most susceptible to that. So we know doing just one thing, building sewers, greatly increased life expectancy. And in so doing this, and modern medicine, for example, and safety and et cetera, in so doing, what we have done is we have created a disaster on this planet, which is that the planet is warming up because of the vast amount of carbon dioxide that we're spewing out with our fossil fuels. That would not have happened if the population had stayed at 1 billion instead of 8 billion. We've gone from 1 billion to 8 billion in about 100 years because of these advances. So we know that. So now we have this terrible climate crisis, right? So if we had known that and we had a time machine, would you go back and say, okay, we shouldn't build sewers? Would you go back and say, okay, we shouldn't have developed these medicines?
No.
Ergo, should we not treat this, what many people regard, and in some ways I do, this illness known as aging? It's certainly, should we not treat it? Aren't physicians bound to let's see,
do no harm.
Not only do no harm, but the 6th or 7th modern version of the Hippocratic Oath says, whenever possible, use prevention, because prevention is preferable to, I can't remember how it's worded, but basically treatment of an illness once it's come on. That's in the Hippocratic Oath that you...
Well, actually, yes. Which actually, I mean, I think there is some, perhaps in a graduation ceremony of medical school, it actually never happened at my medical school.
I've heard actually that a lot of medical schools don't actually do it. But yeah.
But we're all aware
presumably
of it.
you ascribe to it.
Yes, absolutely. Completely. Yeah. Fascinating. We could go on all day. I mean, and I really appreciate you coming.
My pleasure.
Talking to us and the listeners. To be continued.
Sounds great.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much for both of you.
Keep going. I think you need to keep moving forward.
Well, I'll tell you, I get up every morning, look in the mirror, and I think I got to work harder because I see the old guy that I don't feel like I am inside.
Yeah.
So I'm in a hurry.
Yeah, we actually don't really need to end at this point. But one thing that we talked about on the phone was your personal perspective of the timing of this and relative to what's it going to do to you.
Right.
having parents that live to good old ages, and some of mine did, that is this going to happen quickly enough to be positive for you, or I'm significantly older than you, me. And so it's just, but that's, there are a million questions that come out of this. And so seeing, hearing what's happening, in the Petri dish, so to speak, is just, or learning about that, hearing about it, hearing what experiments are being done, what's being found is just so stimulating. It's just tremendous.
It's stimulating for me. I think about it every day. And it's right. I am at an age where a lot of people retire. There's no way in hell I want to retire now. I'm just having way too much fun, and I want to be a part of these discoveries. It's very gratifying.
Yeah, and it's better. They're going to stay younger, not retiring.
Well, that's another thing too.
Yeah.
If you're stimulated by your work, that's an anti-aging, that has an anti-aging impact right there.
Yeah. But if the world doesn't, like, the problem I see with this isn't so much, should we or shouldn't we, the ethical thing. It's if the world, everything about the world that is happening in a certain way based on age, it would have to stop being that way. It would have to.
That has been true all along.
Right?
Largely.
Because, I have friends that are stay-at-home moms that then can't get a job because now they're older and everyone's hiring younger. And so how are they going to, if they're living longer? So everything would have to change so much because it's all been set up a certain way.
But that's our little glimpse of our period of time, right? What was the birth rate 300 years ago? The birth rate, not the rate of survival of children, but the birth rate. Women had many, either they died or they had many children.
Right.
There wasn't even effective birth control.
Right.
So we adjusted to that in society. We will adjust to this. And a younger employee might be 50 or 60 years old. They may be regarded as a younger employee.
Yeah. If the world caught up, if indeed that happened. If you look at anything, if you look at, I see what you're saying, but even if you take something as basic as the school system, it is not caught up to the world we live in. Yeah. It teaches in a way that it was taught 50 years ago still.
So oral birth control was developed 60 years ago, about something like that, right? Oral contraceptives. Have we caught up with that, or are there people in our society who don't think it should be used, right? It's transformed society, but we haven't caught up, or at least there's still people who are concerned about using birth control. Right. But society adapted very quickly to oral contraception, especially oral contraception. Think about it. The women's movement that occurred when I was a young man was a direct product of I think, contraception.
Oh, absolutely.
And society adjusts. Just as we as creatures, living creatures, have homeostasis, which means it's like a thermostat. We, if it's a little warm, we cool it off. A little cold, we wind it up. Just as we do that with our metabolism, our physiology, and so forth. Society doesn't do it well, but it adapts, and I think we will adapt to this. Yeah. We better, I don't know if there are other things. Can we adapt to the fact that we have nuclear weapons? Which, can we adapt to AI? I don't know.
Yeah,
this one I'm a little less worried about, frankly.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
I mentioned one other thing. I forgot to say this, but the increase in life expectancy, incidentally, or the increase in the population of humans with increased life expectancy is much, much more minor with lifespan extension, if it does extend life spans. Even to 120, the impact is much, much, much less than it was with all of the technologies like sewer systems and medicine. And the reason for that is that those resulted in essentially wiping out infant mortality. One infant produces offspring, and those offspring produce offspring, and that creates exponential growth, which is exactly what we've had. The human population going from 1 billion to 8 billion. All of these interventions we're talking about are post-reproductive. We want to extend the productive, healthy period, post-reproductive period of humans. So, if I live a lot longer, I'm not going to have more kids. It's not going to contribute to the population nearly in the same degree.
So what age would you begin to start? I mean, if you had to guess, because I know you don't know. At what age would you start to treat for?
We're going to be in an awkward position. I tell my students all the time about this. I look at them and say, you guys are going to need to make a decision at maybe a somewhat younger age, certainly much younger than me, about whether you want to start taking something or doing a treatment that seems very promising, or in fact really works, at least in the short term. We don't know what the long-term implications are. People, teenagers may have to face those decisions, or parents might. Do I want my teenager to live to 150 years? At some point, I think that is a decision that may be faced.
Wow.
I mean,
there are all the concerns with increasing population of overpopulation and being able to support calorie-wise all of the increased numbers and distribution. I mean, the planet makes enough food for the population 2 or 3-fold, I think. Right. But distribution is a problem with that. But if we're dealing with that increased population, human society and technology is going to solve some of these problems of being able to create food more efficiently.
Sure.
And not rely on wheat fields to do it.
Right. Foods that have much more minor environmental impact, for example. Yes.
Like, manufactured protein,
right.
for instance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's no reason you couldn't make utterly healthy, completely synthetic foods.
Yes.
There's no biological or chemical reason you could not achieve that, for example, in vats or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's correct. Again, I do want to emphasize that if we extend lifespan, let's say instead of a life expectancy of late 70s or early 80s, it goes to 100, the impact on the world population is not huge. The median age of humans will be older, but we'll change what we expect in the arc of life. People may be essentially getting higher education well into their 20s, perhaps to 30 if we're living longer. We might have more wisdom, maybe. I could hope, but we can hope for that. I did want to pick up on one other thing.
Okay.
You said, is this going to affect us, for example?
Mm-hmm.
You were asking me what the time frame here is. I think that's what you're...
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to make any guesses, but what I said when we discussed earlier on the phone about this was, I think based on the way the science is going, I think there's a high probability that in my lifetime, my parents, if I live as long as my parents did, which was to their mid to late 90s, it was very fortunate. I think there's a very high probability that this science will have an impact on my own medicine and things I will do at some point in my life. Yeah. I think that will be true. Will it extend my lifespan? It's possible by at least a few years. I think it's likely based on the rate that this science is progressing.
And one of the things that we talked about before is just what I think you were calling the health span. Mm-hmm. We want this increased time to be productive time, not just increasing old age, so that we right. at 90 we continue to live, but right. we're not really much good to anybody,
right.
and particularly ourselves.
Yep. Yeah. So I mean, if the median age of humans is later, but they have the vigor, the mental acuity, the physical strength of a younger person, is that a bad thing for society? I mean,
no, but the opposite is.
The opposite is, and that's what we're dealing with now. Yeah. And now what we're doing is we're doing everything we can to extend the morbid period of life, right. frankly, if I right. might say that. Yeah. I mean, we do, the medical community is there to save people's lives regardless of almost regardless of their state. And in fact, most states don't allow euthanasia, for example. So you do everything you can to keep a patient alive, regardless of how miserable their life may be.
Right.
We want to achieve the opposite.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we're favoring euthanasia, but we want to, if we get morbidity compression, that really unpleasant period of life could be short.
Right. It's a major problem. Yep. Well, thank you again.
Yep. Thank you again.
Well, thanks for listening. We're getting really good feedback. We'd really appreciate a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. Thank you. You can always DM the Vagina Doctor Instagram with any questions or topics you'd like to learn more about, or email us. The Vagina Doctor Podcast. It all starts here.